Hi Neha.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can. What about everybody else? Can you hear us clearly? I have a bit of a hearing problem, so today I got my hearing, the what is it called? Earplugs. So that I can hear clearly and I don't have to keep the phone just in front of me to be able to hear. So now that everybody's here, first of all, thank you, Neha, so much for coming and joining us. And I'd just like to introduce Neha to you. I met Neha last year, isn't it?
Yeah.
We met last year. I had taken them for a food walk. There were some historians who had come from England. So Neha received her doctorate in history from Royal Holloway University of London in 2019. Her PhD thesis, From the Court to the Kitchens, Food Practices of the Mughal Elites, delves into the history of food consumption at Mughal court from the 16th to the 18th century and engages with the themes of rituals, emotions, medicines, ethics, pleasure, and connoisseurship practices. Now, that is something, that when we think of food, we only think of it as something that is going to fill our stomach. We don't realize that the Mughal food, especially if you've read Ain Akbari, how many things went into it, and the kind of, the Hakims who were involved, and there must be so many other things that it didn't just serve as a food, something to fill your stomach with. There were so many other things involved with it. So can you just give us a brief on that, Neha?
Yeah. So the general idea of what food does, even now, it's not very different, right? So when you're unwell, you still have your mother telling you to have probably honey and ginger. So it's not just something which will fill your stomach. It's also something which conditions your body, brings about a qualitative change in your body. And that is what primarily the Mughals also engaged with, that kind of tradition. But in saying that, there's also a difference in food as something which you eat when you're hungry and food as medicine which you take when you're unwell. So this broad category of food can then be subdivided into these two kind of things. And at the Mughal court, as you said, there were a lot of physicians who were involved in food, ensuring that the food which reaches the emperor's table is, in that sense, a balanced sort of composition, is in a balanced composition, because body in general in the early modern period became a very important site of building identity, of exercising power, and the health of the empire was always equated to the health of the emperor. So in that sense, food played a very big part in the body politic, in the understanding of the empire. So it was not just, I mean, it needs to be stripped off this romantic idea of food as decadence or just pleasure. I mean, they did have their own pleasure that they with. It's not our definition of pleasure, but they did have their own set of ideas that they were working with. But yeah, so food is a lot more than just grandeur of the empire. It's something which nourishes the empire in that sense.
I was just reading about a paper that you had read, I think, in Shiv Nadar University, which was on something like this only, that the consumption practices and discourses employed by the Mughal emperors to fashion themselves at universal, sacred and temporal sovereigns and exercise limited power over the bodies of the imperial cities, which is something which is what you've just said, that it wasn't, there were so many nuances to what they were eating and how they were eating. So, which brings me now to the question that, whenever I work with architecture, I work with Mughal architecture. When we talk about the Mughals, we either talk about the wars, we talk about a few of the emperors like, say, Aurangzeb, Akbar, or Shah Jahan, and what they built, where they went and fought. We hardly ever talk of what they eat. For me, my first exposure to the Mughal food was when I was translating this Bazm-e-Akhir into City of My Heart, and I came over a detailed दस्तरखान जो बादशाह के सामने लगता था, हालांकि बादशाह खुद जो थे वो सिर्फ बटेर का शोरबा पीते थे, but even then, so I went and researched all these recipes. Some of them, of course, I knew I had cooked. So how did you leave all this aside and become interested in food history?
A lot of people say it's because I'm a woman, I'd be interested in this. That's not the point.
That's stereotyping.
Yeah, there's a politics to the kind of history which is always written, right? So all the narratives about the army, about administration, bureaucracy, they were written they were written as a rebuttal to the colonial narrative, where the Mughals were always portrayed as the dark era and the colonizers bringing in modernity.
Yes.
So you need to find a villain, right? So as a rebuttal to that, in the earlier periods, a lot of nationalist historians would, it's an anachronistic sort of exercise where looking for modern day concepts, and you're trying to impose modern day concepts back in time, but they started looking for these rational, logical institutions as a rebuttal to the colonial narrative. So obviously they were writing about highly systematic empire. They were very guilty about even thinking about these sites of decadence or pleasure. So they were always marginalized. Even the Marxist historiography, they would talk about systems of production. They talk about agrarian production, trade, because they seemed like more important topics to talk about at that point. But now, thankfully, as we've come along, we've come along a long way, and a lot of people actually working on code society. Because, finally people are going on wars, find they're part of the bureaucracy, but what about their everyday lives? They were people like you and me. So what did they do in their everyday life? That is equally important, because having an official rank of 2000 is something, but what does that imply in a social setting? How are you fashioning yourself to be a rank holder of 2000? What kind of lifestyle do you have? What does that rank speak about you in a larger social setting? Also, so thankfully now there's work on music, there's work on magic at the court, and all these use categories which were being used by the Mughals, they used the vocabulary which was being used by the Mughals and not imposing a present-day understanding of what magic is, whether it's science or not, what music is, does it amount to leisure, what is the idea of leisure in the Mughal court. So in that sense, my work speaks to this kind of historiography where I look at food. Also, it comes from a very personal place of interest in food in general. I love reading. I've always loved reading about food, so it made sense to then transition into researching on food. So in that sense, there's a shift in the historiography, and it's a really interesting shift.
Yes, I was, the other day, I think I was hearing a lecture by Sajjad Rizvi. He was joined, who was talking about Islamic occult sciences. Yeah. So I found that so interesting. These are things we talk about at home. We do talk about jadoo tona or nazar lag gayi or uske kaise tod honge, kaat honge, and we do all that. But we never actually thought of it as something that you study or you do research in. So yes, of course, these are things which do need to be studied and do need to be talked about. And
really important to strip them of our current day romanticism.
Yes.
Because then what you do is you're losing out on the nuance. You're trying to age a society by current present day lens, which does not do justice to that kind of society. So when I see a lot of people, not Matt obviously, he's a brilliant scholar, but a lot of people when they're writing about courtly practices or activities, they often resort to phrases like, this emperor was way ahead of his time because he did that X activities. No. What then you're doing is you're doing injustice to the discipline because you're completely taking it out of the context. You're not trying to understand the context. If he's living in those times and practicing those things, those are very much part of that time. He's not ahead of his time. So it's really important to strip that romanticism, actually delve deeper into sources, read multiple sources, and that's when you get a better sense of why a certain practice was being used or employed and to what end.
So, which then brings me to the historiography that you studied, the sources that you studied for your paper, because I know about the 2 books that Salma Appa has translated, but what are, apart from that and everybody, what are the other sources you consulted, and how did you read them?
So, I broadly work on food practices, and cuisine is one part of it. I locate it within a larger discourse. So, an obvious starting point is actually the imperial records, the autobiographies and the biographies. But now the important point is not to just cherry pick portions which talk about food, because those are just nuggets of information without any context. So you read the entire chronicle to get a sense of where they're talking about food, what happens after that, what's happening before that. So first is that, and also like even with the Ain-e-Akbari and the Akbarnama, the problem is it's a highly curated imperial record. It's written under the patronage and very fine scrutiny of Akbar. So what you're getting is a very sanitized picture. You're not getting the whole picture. And thankfully, in case of Akbar, we also have a Badauni who's giving you a different perspective of the court. He's a bitter man for his own reasons, but he's giving you a perspective. So, for example, the Ain mentions about Akbar's vegetarian eating habits, and doesn't really talk about where these habits are coming from. And now the sense is because we are so used to the categories of secular, communal, Hindu, in such rigid terms, and sadly Hindu food is vegetarian, Muslim food is non-vegetarian. So what people, when they generally read is, they go like, oh, Akbar was secular because he was eating all this vegetarian food. But that's not the point. When you read Badauni, his first criticism obviously is, he says that how there were Rajput wives in the harem, and that's why he stopped eating garlic, that's why he stopped eating onions. But there are also a lot of radical in quotes, Sufi groups who were practicing vegetarianism. They were present at Akbar's court. Badauni is equally critical of them because his idea of what Islamic radicalism or Sufi sort of conception of religion was very different from these groups. And if you read, so you pick on that, then you go and read the histories of those groups, where they were operational, what were their food habits, and then you actually see that it was a cross-section of traditions which were coming together into Akbar's vegetarianism. It was not just the Rajput wives. So in case of Akbar, you can do that. Baburnama and Jahangirnama are extremely rich when it comes to discussions on food. In case of Jahangir, if you read the accounts written by his courtiers, they give you an additional perspective. So there's Mirza Nathan, who was posted in Bengal during Jahangir's reign, and he talks about the kind of food practices that he was practicing when he was in Bengal. And obviously, he had a massive mansion because he's the governor of that particular area. So he's also trying to assert his power in that area as an emperor's viceroy in some sense. So he's imitating to a certain extent his practices, but they're also coming in contact with the local traditions. So every time you pick a source, you need to corroborate it with multiple sources around the same time. And also there are a lot of European travel accounts, which again have their own politics, where a lot of these European travelers insert themselves as the inner eye into the court, which they were not, because they were always on the periphery. But what is interesting about these accounts is, because they're mostly based on market gossip, it gives you a sense of what was people's perception
yes,
happening in the court. So that is being filtered down. So instead of just taking them, either just neglecting them or taking them on the face value, the idea is then to see what is the nature of the source, who's the patron of the source, who's the audience of the source. Then a lot of archival documents, archival records. Once you go to the archive, there are multiple. Thankfully, I happened to chance upon a couple of private collections, which, once my book is out, those records hopefully will be out. Couple of those. Then the kitchen records, which talk about various mandis where fruits were coming from, how they were being distributed within the harem or the court, like courtiers, between the courtiers in general. There are a lot of Shikarkhana records, which talk about what was being hunted, how many people are going for this hunt. So there are things like that. And poetry is so rich in food metaphors. Again, how do you distill those metaphors? How do you make sense of, a lot of people reject poetry as a source of history writing, which is not a good practice, because again, it's rooted in a milieu. It's talking about that period. So poetry is a really rich source, especially, Shahjahanabad, if you want to talk about Shahjahanabad, 18th century onwards, poetry becomes a really important source of sort of building a narrative about everyday life in Shahjahanabad. So those
there are so many verses on kebab and korma and nehari, and of course वो अकबर इलाहाबादी का बहुत मशहूर है कि बाद मेरे क्या होगा, वो अहबाब क्या कोरमा कबाब खाएंगे. There's one question which just a sec. Because you talked about the vegetarian food, somebody asked about Sufiana food. Can you just explain that before we go further, since we are already talking about the vegetarian food?
That's what I was saying. Abul Fazl calls it Sufiana.
That's us. I thought we can take this question and finish it off here. Now, when you are talking of food and the nuances and the emotions connected to it and the politics of the food. So how important do you think is cultural history? Because that is the field in which I also work. But I work, of course, in a slightly different field from yours. But cultural history for me is a very, very important aspect of history. So how do you view it, and what do you think its importance is? The culture and the food, the culture of the court and the cultural practices of the people.
So, like as I said, right, it's not separate from the politics of the period. It's not separate from the social history of the period. I mean, you can't talk about these categories in isolation. Economic history cannot exist without political, political cannot exist without social. So these are interconnected categories. Just to put more value on one because it sounds serious to us, because it makes sense to our worldview, doesn't make the other category less important for the people who were living in that period. Also, in some aspect, everything is cultural, right? If you're talking about the politics of the court, as I said, the politics of representation, then, in that you're employing the kind of dress you would wear, the kind of perfumes you would put on yourself, the kind of food you'd eat, how you would carry yourself, how you would talk, the kind of education that you are expected to receive, adab, it's a broad category, right? A lot of things fall under adab. So the kind of adab that you're going to cultivate. So it becomes, if you really want to get a peek into what was happening during the Mughal time, I think cultural history becomes a good starting point. Like my work technically falls under the cultural category umbrella, but again, I talk about through that I talk about politics, I talk about intellectual history of the period, I talk about social history of the period, I talk about opening up of the court to the larger bazaar world and how that starts happening. So it becomes an important sort of node to then get into larger questions, and all of them are equally relevant.
When is your book out?
As soon as somebody gives me a postdoc.
Okay, so we're just waiting for that, because I think this book is going to be quite a landmark book for all of us, especially those who are interested in cultural history. And one question that I wanted to ask when you were talking about, were Rajputs vegetarians? Because I had the impression that they were not.
No. So again, there are certain periods where vegetarianism is practiced. For example, during a holy festival. But again, there's a holy festival where they actually go and hunt wild boars. It's called the Festival of Ahira, which is the spring festival. So there's spaces, so obviously in a temple space, in a sacred temple space, meat is not being consumed, because we're talking here about, again, what is Hinduism, again, is a question, right? It's not one unitary sort of religion. There's Brahmanic Hinduism, there's Vedic Hinduism, Tantricism has been absorbed into Hinduism, and all these different groups have varied food practices. Brahmanic Hinduism was vegetarian, primarily largely vegetarian, and how that happened, D.N. Sharma's brilliant book, The Holy Cow, actually traces the history of beef eating in India and how with the coming of Brahmanical Hinduism that sort of recedes. So yes, Rajputs or Vaishnav followers, Vaishnavites, so during the temple festivals, temple ceremonies, no, there's no meat which is used. But when you also look at their records, the Shikar Khana records from the Rajput kitchens, clearly they're hunting, they're cooking that hunt. They go for this spring festival of Ahira, where they actually go and hunt the wild boar, because the wild boar is again associated with goddess Lakshmi. It's to please her, basically, in that sense. So they were not vegetarian. There were phases when everybody during the Mughal period was vegetarian. Even Jahangir would not eat meat during the Jain festival of Paryushan. So the time periods when people would switch to vegetarianism, but primarily meat was also consumed. And this, for us, it's a big debate. For them, it didn't seem like that big of a...
I think nobody would have thought that 300-400 years later, we're going to be sitting and talking about what they ate and what they didn't eat. And
you can fast for 12 days and then go back. Akbar talks about how after this fast, meat would come from the harem. So he's been observing this purification ritual, and then meat comes in as the first meal, and there's no sense of impurity attached to meat. So that's it.
So another question that I have regarding this is that today when we think of Mughal history, we everything is very black and white for us. And even as far as food is concerned, when we think of the Mughals, we think of them as eating a lot of meat, and even actually why just Mughals, any Muslim emperor, any Muslim ruler, as we just saw in the trailers of that Padmavati and some other movie, where they're sitting and actually like eating like barbarians, which would be very far from the truth. So in Nuskha Shah Jahani, when I was reading it, I could understand that much of Farsi. I could read that as well as Salma Appa's translation. Shah Jahan is eating a lot of vegetarian food, including aloo ka bhurta, baigan ka bhurta, and from what I could make out was that the recipe was very similar to what we are making today, including cholai ka saag, which is something which would a very die-hard vegetarian would eat cholai ka saag. So how can we, was there any record on what were the favorite foods of the emperors or even the harem, or was it just that because I'm sure with the hakims involved, there must be some method to the way food was cooked and served.
Yeah. So just a small, I think, clarification. There was no aloo.
Sorry, yes, Portuguese brought the aloo.
The British, I mean the Dutch and the British. But yeah, there's a lot of vegetarian food, and also see again, as I said, this was not a big deal in terms of if there are 10 variants of a pulao with meat, there'll be 15 variants with vegetables, because the idea was to have a balanced diet. Right, to not like Akbar talks about not making his stomach the tomb of dead animals. Right, so their bodies didn't function very differently from ours. They were still human. So if they're just gonna sit and hog on meat, how do you then be athletic and go back? Right. So also see with the Mughals, it's really interesting that there are this very they're at the cusp of Central Asian traditions and the South Asian tradition, right? So they stick to both. I hate using the word syncretic culture, but there's an amalgamation of both the cultures. So you have vegetarian pulav, you have this one particular Rajasthani dish which is made with bangan called badanjan, because that was the word for bangan, and there are variants of bangan with meat, there are variants of bangan with just bangan, of the badanjan with just brinjal. So vegetarianism in that sense was not, I mean, it's not a big deal. They ate a lot of khichdi. A lot of it did not have meat. Jahangir talks about this millet khichdi which he had in Gujarat. And he talks about how you've never tasted something as good. And then he asks his cooks to go and learn how to make that khichdi, and that subsequently becomes part of the culinary manuals that are there from the period. So this idea, and also there was a very clear sense of how weather plays a part in conditioning your body. So in summer, you're supposed to eat light meat. So a lot of vegetables would be eaten. A lot of light broths are being eaten. Because how external elements sort of condition your body, as the Unani sort of tradition explains, played a big part in how they thought of their bodies and how they wanted to cultivate their bodies. So, and a lot of talk, like they have names of so many talks which are difficult to even trace right now. Like I can't even find entries from them in dictionaries or like when I speak to people. So we don't even know if we've lost of those kind of vegetables.
So that food according to weather is something I grew up with. कि ये खाना गर्म होता है, ये खाना ठंडा होता है. And I remember my grandfather, from ever I was a child, I remember him eating that the entire summers he ate lauki gosht, and he would not eat the meat piece. He would only eat the shorva and the lauki. And the winters was gajar and salan. So he would again eat the gajar, and that was his practice throughout his life. So these were things I think that they all, and another thing which I remember was that he used to, after retirement, he was living in Aligarh, he was a government servant, and at one particular place he was posted, I'm forgetting which place it was, somewhere in UP, जहाँ का पानी कहते हैं खारी था, मतलब. So he apparently for 2 years drank soda. He didn't drink water. So a lot of
this, that's what, like, every element of the nature, that was their understanding, plays a part in keeping you healthy, and that's why you have to strike a balance. I recently saw a documentary series on Netflix where I heard somebody say that how chaat was invented because apparently the water of the of Yamuna was too salty, or like there was something wrong with the water of Yamuna. So Shah Jahan said, let's invent something so spicy that it counteracts the effect of this bad water. In theory, would make sense, but you would not have set up a huge city on the banks of a river if the water was so bad. Because that, again, elements of nature played a part in everything that they in every way the empire was conceptualized. You will not go and establish a big city, a big fortification on a river which is dirty. But in theory, yes. I mean, if there's something which is affecting your body in a negative way, you'd always find food items to counteract the negatives of that.
So that, I think, was the Faiz Nahar, which had been left stagnant for quite some time, since the Faiz Nahar was the one that was feeding the city of Shahjahanabad, and it had been built at the time of Firoz Shah Tughlaq and become stagnant, repaired again during the time of Akbar, and stagnant by the time Shah Jahan comes. So can you also talk about the spices that were used? Because when I was reading the recipes in N.A. Akbari, I see a lot of cinnamon and pepper being used. What were the other spices that were used? And of course, saffron.
Yeah, like there was turmeric, there was saffron, there was cloves, a lot of ginger, dry ginger, which is called zanjabil. Then pepper, as you mentioned, was very important because it was the only source of providing heat to the food. There were no green chilies. There was a lot of sugar which was used, even in savory dishes. So none of the Mughal sort of savory dishes are completely savory. There's a lot of lemon and sugar which is used because, again, you're trying to strike a balance in terms of flavor profile. Because, again, every flavor does something to the humors in your body. So that is there. A lot of elaichi, a lot of cardamom. Then at times they also mention what region should a spice come from. So they say Khurasani Nabat, which is kind of a sweet sugar candy from Khurasan, or they'll say Gujarati long. So also specifications of which region should these spices come from. Because again, how crops are growing organically in a region has an effect on the crop, and then it sort of translates into your body. So yeah, a lot of common spices that we know of now, except for red chili.
So can you just we'll just take the questions after this. One more question I have, then we'll take the questions. Which were the foods that were brought from outside India? By the Portuguese, or by even, as I said, somebody had sent me a detailed question on samosa, but that predates your work, in case you'd like to talk about from the advent of the Delhi Sultans or the advent of the Mughals, the foods that were brought from outside.
So a lot of melons from Central Asia. I mean, if you read the Babarnama, he paints this picture of how there are no melons in India, how he's constantly nostalgic about the sweetness of melons. But now again, that could be read as a poetic device for being nostalgic about a place and not necessarily commenting on the quality of melons. But again, his sense of how he writes a letter to his friends saying, and this is after he gives up on alcohol, and he's like, I can't drink alcohol and I can't even eat those sweet melons, and I don't know why I'm alive. So the melons, a lot of apples from Kashmir. I mean, I don't know if we want to call it part of, I mean, again, India, what is India in the pre-colonial period is a question.
Let's call it Hindustan.
Yeah, I mean, the subcontinent, largely Pakistan, Afghanistan, Kashmir, northern India. So a lot of melons are coming, apples are coming from Kashmir, grapes are coming from, again, from Central Asia. Betel leaves are actually going from Hindustan to Iran, and there's a really interesting exchange between Aurangzeb and the Safavid Shah. This is when Aurangzeb was prince, because, I mean, we have this bad habit of calling him Aurangzeb even after he became an emperor. Should be called Alamgir. So Aurangzeb, when I say Aurangzeb, I mean when he was a prince. where they're talking with, where the Shah is writing to him saying, last time you sent me Lahori beetle leaves, and they'd gone bad because they were not packed properly. So Aurangzeb sends a reply saying, this time I'll make sure that they are wrapped in fine muslin cloth and they don't go bad. And then when the ambassador, emissary sort of comes in and he brings a letter saying, oh, these leaves were excellent. So yeah, Hindustan provided beetle leaves to Iran, and a lot of foods are coming in from Central Asia. The Portuguese actually introduced half of the stuff that we eat as common Indian food today. Except for, I mean, pineapple was introduced way before the late 17th century because there's mention of pineapple even in the Ain. It was called traveling jackfruit because, again, how you in sort of containers, and the closest possible thing that was circulating in the Indian economy at that time was jackfruits, and it looked like jackfruit because it has a spiky outer surface. So it was called traveling jackfruit. You find a mention of that in Ain. But potatoes, tomatoes, chilies are all, I mean, potatoes not so much the Portuguese, the Dutch and the English, but chilies and tomatoes. And it's also really interesting that, again, how things get named, right? So tomatoes were initially called Vilaiti Bengal because they're nightshades, and Bengals were already, I mean, people knew about the eggplant, so they're also nightshades, same family. They didn't have the vocabulary for it, so it was called Vilaiti Bengal. Similarly, aloo, I mean, it's not the white potatoes that the sweet potato which was gotten was not the same American potato that we think of. That's why even now when we see sweet potato in India, it's very different. Our shakarkandi is not same as the American yellow sweet potato. So a lot of these ingredients were being brought in. Late 17th century was a great time of trade. There was massive global expansion happening. If somebody's interested, there's a really interesting book on Columbian exchange, things that traveled from the Atlantic to Spain and Portugal and then to the rest of the world. And it not just talks about food, it actually also talks about disease, something which we should all be interested in right now, how different microorganisms also travel during this Atlantic sort of expansion. So it's called Columbian Exchange, or if somebody is interested, you can read that. And there's a lot more on that now.
We'll take... Carry on. I'm just looking at the questions which have been asked.
Yeah, so samosa, it's actually, there are different ways, and it's called sambusa, sanbosa, samosa in Hindustani. My sense is, and this is all the research that I have done. If somebody knows better, I'm willing to learn more. But my sense is, halwa and samosa are actually Arabic food commodities. And so, again, a lot of Timurid food traditions were borrowed from the Abbasid food tradition. And Timurids are the sort of larger lineage which the Mughals belong to. I mean, they call themselves Timurids, we call them Mughals. So a lot of that also filters through, and also there's a text called Nematnama. Again, the Nematnama is a 15th century Sultanate text, the late 15th, early 16th. So yeah, so there is also recipes for samosa there.
So many recipes there.
Sorry?
I said so many samosa recipes in the Nematnama.
Yeah, so again, these Deccan Sultanates were not, again, isolated from the larger Islamic world. The boundaries were not as rigid as we think of them right now. So people were traveling, food was traveling, ideas were traveling. So even during the Sultanate period, there's samosa, but it actually, I think, I mean, I'm 90% convinced, is an Abbasid dish, which then travels to all the parts where people from this sort of region were going to.
There's one comment by Paul Abraham, and in case you'd like to take this further. Some of these distinctions, I think this is because we were talking of the foods earlier, non-veg and veg. Also, some of these veg, non-veg narrative is somewhat North Indian. In the South, there are less of these boundaries. Would you like to comment on that?
Like I said, these are modern day conceptions that we impose on the Mughal world. Right, we are working with our modern categories of what is vegetarian. I mean, who eats vegetarian food? What does that speak of a person? What kind of politics that it lends itself to? there is, I mean, even if you look at the cookbooks which were being written in the Deccan, there's equal amount of meat, there's equal amount of vegetables. Same with the Mughals. They were not operating with these categories, we are. So the onus is on us to unlearn to be able to see their world better.
And could you just talk a little bit beyond food? Because I've been working with seeing the Red Fort Museum and a couple of other museums. I've seen a lot of Celadon and Gauri plates, which were used for plating, so that if in case it is said, believed for the Gauri and the Celadon, that if poison is introduced, it will crack. So can you talk of the plates, the plating, and the danger of poison? How did they go about preventing that?
I remember you asked this
Yes.
question in my conversation with Satsad. But no, the deal is, and it's a problem with a lot of museums as well, that when you find an object, it appears to be a shape that you think it would serve that purpose. It's labeled as that. I, in my text, at least, have not found reference to these to these kind of plates. So I would also be interested in learning a little more about material history in that sense, because to me these are new. I know they're brass vessels which were used a lot. Very little of gold and silver, primarily brass, because there are also texts on how these utensils were then taken care of, how they would actually go, and plating would be done regularly so that it doesn't become rusty or turn green in color and things like that. A lot of ceramics from China, and actually, sadly, we don't have those many left for the Mughals, but if somebody is interested in Safavid history, there are these beautiful bowls, Chinese porcelain, with inscriptions on the bowls. And I remember seeing one at the V&A in London, and it has this really beautiful inscription which says, it doesn't, and it's a very regular looking bowl, and it says, it doesn't matter how good the bowl is as long as the soup tastes delicious. So again, there's a sense of, let's not just be grand in terms of how the food is being served, but what is actually being served. A lot of ceramics from China, a lot of brass utensils, a lot of jade, but that's mostly for beverages, and that would again be used in courtly settings. I'm sure, I mean, not all the Mansabdars had access to jade utensils, but yeah, a lot, I mean, Jahangir's wine cups are all jade, and different kinds of jade, and again they have these beautiful inscriptions on them which sort of convey a sense of what wine implied or meant for the position it held for these emperors. A lot of times they also had these small magic formulas written on it to repel any sort of bad effect of food. For poisoning, also there are a lot of metallurgical sciences which were being employed. So there's use of something called goat stone, which is believed to change, I mean, it's found in the gallbladder of goats. So physicians would actually check the goats and feel for the stone, and then the stone would be taken out. It's believed that it changes color when it comes in contact with poison. It was also used in terms, if a snake bit you and you had a wound, they would actually tie the stone to your body so that it pulls out all the poison. So gallstones were used. Again, jade was dipped at times to check for poison. It's a lot of metallurgical sciences, and that's why I was saying food is not just food. It brings in a lot of allied sciences together. So.
And when we are cooking, I think our everyday food also, we don't realize how many influences there are in the food that we are cooking. Just a sec.
Food tasters whose job it was to taste the food before it was served to the emperor. And these tasters were also employed in mansions of the other courtly elite. So there was a system in place to make sure that the food is safe in that sense.
So Tarana Hussain Khan is asking, and she has been working with a Persian manuscript by the Nawab, written for or by the Nawab of Rampur, I think 18th century, and she's recreating the food there in. Has called the chefs, and she's recreating the food in Rampur. One question she has is, what was the role of the cooks in amalgamation of cuisines? I believe there were some records of the khansamas.
So, I mean, I had an exchange with Tarana over the email last week, I think. So the deal is, for the Mughals, we don't have much written by the cooks. But it's not difficult to locate the cooks in Mughal paintings, especially feasting paintings. You'll always see them in the background. Mostly we don't know their names, barring this one cook who Aurangzeb mentions in a letter to his son, talking about how this cook makes this brilliant biryan and he would want him in his service. It's later, towards the later period, when actually this rise of mercantile aristocratic class, which is trying to copy the lifestyle of higher nobles, that's when, because a lot of them were also writing, I mean, just Anandram Mukhlis, I mean, everybody who does Mughal history would be aware of Mukhlis's work. Mukhlis, when he's traveling with an entire entourage, and he mentions the names of his cook, what were they cooking, and he calls them khidmatkar, which could just mean providing any kind of service. So they're not just cooks, they're also fanning him, they're also reading for him, they're also pressing his leg, but then they're also cooking food. So you find those kind of records for the Mughal cooks. Mostly I rely on paintings to sort of recreate some sort of history of the cook. In my work, I talk about a Safavid account. I have a paper which will be coming out soon. It's actually on labor, kitchen labor. And there I talk about that record, I talk about that particular cook and the lineage, he talks about the training, he talks about. So in Mughal context, I'm still to find a document which compares to this brilliant Safavid record, but it does give us a sense because, I mean, it's a bad practice to just do Mughal history in isolation. They were part of this larger Islamic world, and you need to know what was happening in Safavid and Ottoman court. So, yeah.
Paul is asking that I missed what pineapple was called. Can you please repeat the name? Traveling jackfruit.
Traveling jackfruit.
Was Chavli lobia brought by Portuguese?
By lobia, if you mean beans, like the white beans, yes, white beans are, beans are first world crop, New World crop. Sorry, and beans are not being cooked. There's no rajma. So.
Okay. So Bisma has asked any pointers and resources I can look up for early Delhi Sultanate around Iltutmish's time.
So Ibn Battuta is a really interesting account. He talks, also he's traveling through a lot of regions. He also gives a very interesting comparative between, and for him he has a keen eye if he notices something different, because he's been to different regions, he's observed things. That I think would be the easiest sort of account to go to. There's a new book on the Delhi Sultanate, comparatively new. It's on the urban history of the Delhi Sultanate. If you Google for it, I'm sure it will pop up. I don't remember the author's name. There are sections on food. There's a really old article. It is almost impossible to trace it. Food and catering services during the Delhi Sultanate. It was written in 1960s somewhere. That can give you some direction as to where to go. But if you really want to start with something, Ibn Battuta is a really, really interesting and a rich account to dig your feet into.
Sudeep wants to know which book you are reading nowadays.
I'm writing nowadays. Not reading. Can't focus. I'm not reading, but I'm on and off reading Mirror of Beauty. It's one of my favorite books to read.
What were the vessels for cooking made of?
So again, earthen potware, because when you're cooking on dum, that is what was used a lot. A lot of dates. If you've been to Ajmer, you'll see a lot of dates which were donated by the Mughal emperors, and they're made of steel or aluminium, and a lot of them brass, again coated, plated brass. So those were the kind of materials which were being used, but a lot of earthenware, because a lot of food was cooked on dum.
Did the Mughal kitchen borrow any nuances from the Deccan?
No. See, again, these are not, when we say Mughal food or when we say food from the Deccan, Deccan was an area which had very strong connections with the Safavid Empire because these were both Shia empires, right? And Safavid food is again very similar to the Mughal food, barring the Hindustani element in terms of ingredients. So with recipes, what happens, with food dishes, what happens is there's a basic format. So there's a pulao. Now that's a format. What you do with it in terms of, so a format has a procedure. But what ingredients you can add to it depends on where you're geographically located. So even when the Mughals moved to Deccan, I mean, they always loved mangoes, but when they moved to Deccan, suddenly you see the amount of mangoes being used in Mughal cuisine just goes up. Because again, Deccan was an mango producing region. So in terms of recipe formats, even the Neematnama, for example, has similar dishes, the broad category. But what happens, and they follow the same procedure, but what happens within them changes. So the food of Deccan in that sense was not very, very different from Mughal food. Also, Deccan was a region where actually in terms of the food practices, tobacco was introduced way before it reached the Mughal court. Actually, it reaches from Deccan to the Mughal court when one of Akbar's ambassadors comes back. So they certainly are, because of the areas that they were trading with, certain commodities which were available in the Deccan court, not in the Mughal court, and vice versa. And tobacco is one of those examples.
You also talk of your thesis, also talks about rituals, emotions, medicines, ethics, pleasure. Now, we've talked about a lot of these other things. Can we talk about the ethics of food?
Again, as I was saying, ethics of food is moderate consumption. You need to maintain a healthy body. Excess of anything, including fasting, is not good. So this idea that you can be a Puritan Muslim emperor by fasting a lot is also problematic. So excess on either side was not really appreciated. A lot of Sufi saints, on the other hand, would actually go and fast for really long periods because again what they're trying to achieve, the kind of spiritual authority they're trying to achieve is very different from an emperor who's also a temporal being and has to run an empire. So that forms the basis. Even in terms of wine consumption, the ethic is of moderation. As I was telling Sajjad also, it's not the highest register of Islamic purity or piety. There are protocols, and you have to drink wine within those protocols. And that is what defines the practice of wine or alcohol consumption. And also, the idea is that this ethical self then has to be projected to the world. You can't just hold it within yourself. And that's where adab comes into being. So when you're invited to somebody's house, how much would you take? How would you eat? Because that is equally important part of an ethical behavior. So in those terms, when I talk about ethics, those are the kind of things that I go into.
There's one question I think it's quite interesting. What would war food be like? I think what he means is when they went on military campaigns, how were the kitchens that traveled with them, and were there any adaptations in the food at that point of time?
Yeah. So and also like the Mughal, there was no Mughal capital in that term. It was a moving camp. And that's why you have multiple Mughal capitals, right? We have Lahore, we have Agra, we have Shahjahanabad, so they would stay in certain. So when the empire was on the move, the entire household infrastructure was on the move. And if you pick up the English translation of Ain, they've actually redrawn the map of the camp, and you see where the kitchen is located and where the other certain departments are located. So same amount of resource, same amount of people are traveling, but then again, there could be difficulties in procuring a lot of things because obviously the emperor can demand whatever he wants, but he does not have control over time or distance, right? So it will take same amount of time. He can't do anything about it. So in those terms, like I was talking about Jahangir, when he's actually in Gujarat, he tastes the local speciality. And then that gets absorbed into the Mughal culinary tradition. So in those terms, there would also be some like when they're hunting, they would talk about what they hunted, and there's this recipe for, Jahangir talks about how he hunted a duck and he ordered his cooks to make a do pyaza out of it. So again, there's a dish format. What goes into the dish keeps on changing. So
And so
So
since
it's a
we've talked about,
but even when they were on move, the quote was being reproduced when they were on a move as well. So.
and we can't end, we've got just another 10 minutes left. We can't end without talking about the Zere Birya and the biryani, because that's what everybody associates with the Mughals. So I read your article where you said that they ate more khichdi than they ate anything else. So can you just talk briefly about that, and then about Nihari, because there are quite a lot of questions on Nihari. So Sadam wants to know, what did ordinary people eat, and Asif is asking what about Nihari. So can we first talk about biryani, Zere Biryan, and khichdi?
Yeah, so that piece that you're talking about was actually written at a time when I think there was a drive to announce khichdi as the national
As
food
the
of
national
India,
dish.
to be Hindu, some sort of Hindutva links to that debate. So again, the point is, these are dishes that have existed for really long. How they were absorbed by different dynasties, emperors, social, political formations that existed. And it's very interesting. It's like talking about history of yoga and then saying yoga only existed in ancient period and nothing happened to yoga in medieval period. So you erase Islamic history of yoga in that sense. Islamic, I mean, in a very loose. I don't follow medieval as Islamic, those kind of categories, but in that sense, like you're just erasing one part. So khichdi again, just because in our heads it sounds like a very sattvic meal. Not good enough for emperors to eat was not the point. They're really elaborate recipes for khichdi. And the Nimatnama, I mean, because it's easily available, it's English, it's translated in English, a lot of people can read it, so I would just talk about that a little here. The Nimatnama talks about how you layer khichdi with different things. They put gold leaves on khichdi. You and I will probably eat it when we are sick now. I mean, I eat it when I'm sick. For me, it's not a delicacy. But yeah, so again, also the deal is, for us, biryani is something which we think is a very decadent, sophisticated dish. Unfortunately or fortunately, the early modern sort of Timurids did not think that. Even now, when you go to Iran, if you ask, I mean, I had a friend who had come, an Iranian friend, and we were in Hyderabad together during fieldwork, and he asked me to take him out for biryani because he said he's heard so much, and also because, again, Hyderabad had strong connections with the Safavid Iranian Empire. So he was like, why did you want to see what this is? And I took him and he said, that's pulao. Because for him, that was not biryani. For him, biryani is bread with fried meat. Similarly, Zer Biryan, which occurs in Mughal cookbook, Zer Biryan is just a layered fried dish. It could be made with rice. It could not be made with rice. Biryan means to fry. Biryan comes as a step in many Mughal recipes. They'll tell you to make a biryan of onions before you add, say, yogurt to the dish. So biryan just means to fry. It could mean to fry anything. There are recipes for biryan, Zer Biryan, which is layered. There's one Noor Mahali, Zer Biryan in Noor Mahali, which is rice, paneer in a layered form cooked on dum. And
that brings down Noor Jahan and Shah Jahan's talk quite a bit when we say they were fond of. Whenever I've said that they were fond of paneer biryani, that always, jolts people.
And the where names of certain patrons, it either means it was, I mean, obviously it symbolizes that it was patronized by that particular person, or was cooked very, very nicely in that particular person's kitchen. That's why it becomes that important, and the name gets associated with that. I mean, there's no, again, we fight a lot about whether there's something called a vegetarian biryani, fish biryani. Those people did not really bother about it. These are our sort of, the way we are conditioned to think about food. That makes it problematic because, if there's something coming from slightly Muslim Islamic sort of context, how can it be vegetarian? It cannot be, but that's completely false.
So, one more question about Nihari. Does Nihari originate in the Mughal era?
So now, like biryani, Nihari means morning meal. It could be anything. I recently shared a bit about Ibn Battuta talking about khichdi as nihari, right? When did a particular recipe get associated with nihari that we know of today? I'm not sure of. But there's no mention of nihari as a dish in Mughal texts. When they mention that they're eating nihari, it just means they're having breakfast. There's no dish in any of the Mughal cookbooks called nihari. And also, mostly, it's my perception that this was the thing that we eat now is nihari. It's a bazaar invention, or it's not a bazaar invention. It's actually post 18th century, sort of maybe mid 18th century sort of dish, because the recipe sounds very much like a korma that you would find in any of the Mughal cookbooks.
So that is, as I said when I was translating Bazme Akhir, there's a detailed description of the food that was put on Bahadur Shah Zafar's table, and there's no mention of any dish called nihari. We've got just a minute remaining, so before we get cut off, thanks a lot, Neha, for coming. This was a wonderful discussion. I'm sure everybody would have enjoyed it, and now I can continue because this just suddenly goes off. So, as I said, it talks of a lot of kormas there. They talk of korma, they talk of shorva, they talk of kebabs, and there's nothing called nihari. So, that's what even
I think sehri. I mean, is there a dish called sehri? It's a meal time.
So, sehri in my house would mean kofte, because once my brother-in-law had kofta for sehri. So for him, sehri meant kofta. So whenever he wanted to eat kofta, he would say sehri paka dije. So yes, you're right about that. That whatever you eat at a particular time, you start associating that with. So that makes a lot of sense. And we've got just 30 seconds left. So once again, thank you. And there are a lot of thanks from everybody. Any question? One last question that is left. What did ordinary people eat? You can't hear. What did ordinary people eat? If you can take that. There's just 20 seconds left. You can't hear? Okay. I think we'll just end it. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. We are just